The MCU might star more superheroes than you can shake an infinity gauntlet at, but it's really the story of Tony Stark. But how close is the MCU's Tony to the comic book Tony? Here are the things about Iron Man that just didn't make it to the MCU. One of the most surprising things about the cinematic version of Iron Man is that the MCU never adapted Demon in a Bottle, the story that's pretty much defined Tony Stark as a character since it was originally published in 1979. If you know one thing about the comics version of Iron Man beyond rich guy, wears armor, and has a mustache, it's this story. But in case you're not familiar with it, here's the short version. As the name implies, this is the one where Tony deals with his alcoholism and its consequences, even being kicked out of the Avengers before he's finally forced to confront it and go into recovery. In the years since, Tony's struggles with addiction and his occasional relapses have been an intrinsic part of his ongoing story. And despite its age, Demon in a Bottle itself has been praised as one of the best comics to ever mix superheroic action with important real-life issues. Tony has even been a central figure in helping other characters deal with their own similar issues, most notably Carol Danvers, who's portrayed as a recovering alcoholic. Of course, while it's not explored with the depth and consistency that we see in the comics, Tony's drinking problem is pretty heavily alluded to in Iron Man 2. It comes to a head in the scene where he gets drunk and winds up tearing up his own living room in a super-powered fistfight with War Machine.
I don't know what to do.
You gotta be kidding me.
That's it though, and the fact that such a humanizing, relatable, and important aspect of his character is only mentioned briefly is surprising, especially when you consider that other issues like PTSD are central to the plots of Iron Man 3, Avengers Age of Ultron, and even Captain America Civil War. It's a pretty big deal, and making 3 Iron Man movies and another 5 or 6 where he's a central character without getting into it is almost like making a Superman movie where nobody ever mentions he can fly. The defining moment of the first Iron Man movie, which ends up being one of the definitive moments of the entire MCU, comes in its very last line, when Tony Stark ditches S.H.I.E.L.D.'s script and publicly reveals that he's the one who's been wearing the armor.
Truth is, I am Iron Man.
Not only does this help distinguish the Iron Man movies from films about Superman and Batman, where the duality of the heroic and civilian identities is often a pretty big theme, it works really well from a character standpoint. Tony's entire arc in that movie is wanting redemption from his past as an arms dealer, and owning up to both what he's done and what he's doing to make up for it fits right in with his character, especially since he's arrogant enough to want the credit for it. Also, as has been pointed out countless times over the years, the classic method for keeping Iron Man's identity secret by claiming that he's actually Tony Stark's bodyguard just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It does, however, mean that the MCU loses out on some of the stories that were built around Tony trying to keep his secret intact. After all, for years, the Tony of the comics stuck to the whole bodyguard lie. But why? Well, the official company line was that Iron Man was a test pilot who preferred to remain anonymous so as to not attract the attention of Tony Stark's enemies. This reasoning falls apart when you consider that Tony Stark's enemies were going to try to kill both Tony Stark and Iron Man anyway, but it did lead to some pretty wild stories. Armor Wars in particular is a story in which Tony goes after anyone that he suspects of using his technology, leading him to put a serious beatdown on S.H.I.E.L.D. agents and Stingray, a part-time Avenger, and then avoiding any consequences by inventing Randall Pierce, a completely fictional identity for Iron Man's pilot that he created through falsified documents, and then faking Randall's death. Then he hired a new guy to do the job who just happened to sound like, act like, and remember everything that the previous guy did. This would have been pretty complicated to handle in the movies, but come on. Aren't you at least a little sad about not getting to see Robert Downey Jr. wearing a fake mustache over his real mustache and trying to put on a voice to fool Nick Fury? The Tony Stark of the MCU is a bit of a control freak. It's the through line of his character from the original Iron Man all the way to Endgame, as he makes one attempt after another to build a metaphorical, and sometimes literal, suit of armor around the world while events spiral into a cosmic level far beyond his control. The comics version of Tony is the same way, maybe even more so. In fact, he's so hell-bent on controlling the world that after the Marvel Universe gets its first big taste of the danger and conflict that exists beyond our planetary borders, He created a secret cabal in order to do just that. After the Kree-Skrull War, a big piece of Marvel Comics history, he gathers up a group of like-minded individuals to secretly guide the universe. The result is the Illuminati, a team of sorts that includes Tony, Reed Richards, Doctor Strange, Black Bolt of the Inhumans, and Namor. They also offer T'Challa the Black Panther membership in their secret club, but he refuses, knowing that this will only lead to bad things down the road. And does it ever? While they do reap the benefits of sharing information with each other, the members of the Illuminati also make some pretty dubious decisions, including more than one attempt to gather up the Infinity Stones for themselves. The most notable error, though, is an attempt to solve the problem of having the Hulk around by just blasting him off into space and hoping it'll work out for the best. Naturally, this leads to the Hulk returning, stronger and madder than ever, and beating the living crap out of the Illuminati for about 6 issues. Pretty weird that the smartest people in the world didn't see that one coming, isn't it? We all know him as a high-tech weapons designer, but in the comics, Tony Stark's career isn't limited to the technological innovations of the private sector. He also occasionally works for the government, and not just as a defense contractor providing Uncle Sam with their gigantic helicarriers and super science guns. After leading the pro-registration side of the comic book version of Civil War, Tony serves as the director of S.H.I.E.L.D., replacing Nick Fury after the super spy goes underground to pursue his own agenda. Tony's tenure in that job isn't particularly long, and it ends when S.H.I.E.L.D. itself is replaced with a new organization called Hammer, an acronym that doesn't actually stand for anything. Tony's spot as director goes to Norman Osborn. Yes, the guy who very publicly tries to kill Spider-Man while dressed up as a D&D monster.
Finish it! Finish it! Evil!
Yeah, that guy. He gets the job because he shot an alien with a laser gun on TV. Listen, it's a long story. Comics are weird. While we do get a couple of full-scale alien invasions in the films, there's a pretty obvious reason why Marvel Studios decided to leave that one out of the movies. Of course, Tony has another government job that probably would have fit in better. At one point in the comics, Tony takes the job of Secretary of Defense as something of a compromise after the military tries to claim ownership of the earliest Iron Man armor, as it was produced while Tony was still under contract as a weapons manufacturer. Considering that Iron Man 2, released around the same time, actually opens with Tony making a smart-ass remark about how he'd consider taking that same job.
I'm not a joiner, but I'll consider Secretary of Defense, if you ask nice. We can amend the hours a little bit.
This one feels like it came a lot closer to happening than the others. Tony Stark has starred in quite a few comics since his debut in 1963. So obviously, a lot of specific stories never had a chance of making it onto film, even if they would have made for an interesting movie. For example, there's the time Tony's armor came to life and fell in love with him and then crucified him on a desert island and then destroyed itself by tearing out its own heart. When you sum it up that quickly, this story sounds pretty weird, but, well, actually, yeah, it's a weird one. It all started when Tony begins experimenting with what he calls the safe armor. The main feature of this one, aside from achieving new heights of name irony, is an onboard AI that can take over if Tony is incapacitated. In the most ill-fated decision the Marvel Universe has seen since Spider-Man decided not to stop that burglar, he bases this AI on a robot created by Ultron. You remember Ultron, right? The creepy genocidal robot that hates humans? You might not be the genius technologist that Tony Stark is, but you can probably see the problem with the design. Rather than hatred, the AI's negative emotions take the form of a twisted obsession, and once its affections are rebuked, a single white female-style desire to replace Tony. To that end, the armor kidnaps Tony and strings him up on a St. Andrew's cross while he manufactures his own synthetic skin. Naturally, this results in a big fight that ends when Flesh Tony has a heart attack, leaving Armor Tony to suddenly switch gears and tear out its own heart and shove it onto Flesh Tony's chest, using it to keep his heart beating steadily, much as the original armor had. A pretty weird story to bring to film, but hey, Venom showed us that sometimes the best superhero story involves an actor playing 2 roles, one of which is a weird homicidal monster. What's the weirdest Iron Man story of all time? That's easy. It's Teen Tony. If you don't know, Teen Tony is the result of a truly bonkers series of events. Back in 1996, a dozen years before he found himself as the star of everyone's new favorite superhero franchise, very few people actually cared about Iron Man. In fact, he was so unpopular that in order to inject some new life into his title, a story called The Crossing revealed that Tony Stark had been a secret bad guy all along, having been manipulated by Immortus, a time-traveling supervillain. He was shown to have secretly committed some truly heinous acts, including killing 3 people in Avengers Mansion, including one of the Avengers, and attempting to frame Hawkeye for it. Once this was all discovered, the Avengers took a pretty heroic leap of logic and decided that the only way to defeat an evil Tony Stark was to get a good Tony Stark. The problem was that they needed one who was completely free of Immortus' influence, so they bopped over to a parallel timeline and picked up a teenage version of Tony, bringing him back to the regular Marvel Universe and sending him off to fight a version of himself that was older, more experienced, and absolutely willing to kill anyone who stood in his way. Shockingly, this did not go well for teen Tony. Adult Tony tore his teenage self's heart out, only to immediately feel remorse, give teen Tony armor to keep him alive, and then offing himself to stop the bad guys. This whole thing took 25 issues, and it ended with teen Tony taking over the title for a year before the Avengers line was rebooted and then rebooted again a year later. Odds are pretty good that this will absolutely never make it to film, but hey, if they need to introduce a new actor as Iron Man, they have a blueprint ready for it. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more Looper videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.